and welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. In this video, we are going to update and upgrade our Kozilek the Great Distortion EDH deck. What's up, MTG BC? Welcome back to another installment of the Up and Up series. Today we are going to update and upgrade our Kozilek the Great Distortion all-colorless EDH deck. So what we have here are a handful of cards that finally became available and are going to force their way into the 99 of this build. And we have a few other cards that are just going to make the overall deck that much better. So let's begin with a card that finally a copy became available, and now it's going in, and that is going to be Urza Saga. We were un-Urza Saga'd earlier with this deck. No more. Now we've got one copy going in. This is an enchantment land that's going to come into play, and it's going to have a first lore counter that allows us to tap this to give us a colorless mana. When the second lore counter goes on, and we're on to Chapter 2, we can pay 2 mana, tap this, and create a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact we control. And when the third lore counter goes on this, and we end up sacrificing it, we search our library for an artifact card with mana cost 0 or 1, and we put that bad boy onto the battlefield. For the purposes of this deck, that artifact card with 0 or 1 is going to put onto the battlefield one of our very, very powerful mana rocks. It was only a matter of time until we were able to put Urza Saga into this deck, and now it is in there. It is going to replace a land that's most likely, its presence on our side of the battlefield was only going to be temporary to begin with. So if we're going to have one temporary land going in, we might as well have one temporary land going out, and I think the replacement is going to make the deck itself that much stronger. Strip Mine is coming out. Yeah, it taps for a colorless mana, and yes, we can tap and sacrifice this to destroy target land. That is a 1 ability, so you tell me, is it Strip Mine or Urza Saga? Which is the better land? We tap and sacrifice Strip Mine, and an opponent loses one of their lands, and we lose Strip Mine. Or we have Urza Saga in play temporarily. We end up with a construct artifact creature token that gets boosted by every artifact we control, and we put onto the battlefield one of our very valuable mana rocks. I don't think it's much of a competition, folks. We're looking for overall betterment of this deck, and Urza Saga brings it and forces Strip Mine out of the deck. All right, next card going in, we have Thespian Stage. Taps for a colorless. We can pay 2 and tap this, and Thespian Stage becomes a copy of target land and gains its what do we call this? It's copying ability, I guess. Copying ability sounds good. So it will retain its copying ability. So with the number of Urza's lands we have in this deck, this could really, really be helpful. If we're flying high with our life totals, we can have Thespian Stage come down as a copy of maybe Ancient Tomb, or maybe it comes down as another copy of Eldrazi Temple. Either way, not having Thespian Stage in the land base of this deck, well, let's face it, we're handcuffing our own versatility by not doing that. So let's make sure we get that land into our deck, and also keep in mind that that doesn't have to target one of our lands to become a copy of. It could be any land on the battlefield. With Thespian Stage and its copying ability going into the deck, coming out is Zalfrin Void. When it comes into play, we scry 1, we tap for a colorless mana. That's all that this land does, and I don't think there's much of an argument that Thespian Stage is not an improvement over the Void. All right, next card going in, Emergence Zone. Taps for a colorless. We can pay 1 mana, tap this, and sacrifice it, and we can cast spells this turn as though they had flash. Flash enablement is a very nice effect to have in this deck, particularly if we're able to get our commander onto our side of the battlefield at the end of our opponent's last turn, fill up our hand with cards, and then be able to send our 12/12 Menacing General into combat during our next turn. With the Emergent Zone going into play, 1 Basic Wastes is coming out. Now, we're also going to have a Basic Wastes come out for the next card that's going in too. The next land that's going in is also going to replace a Basic Wastes. We must remain mindful to not go too low on our count for wastes. Taking out these 2 will bring our overall count down to 6. I think 6 is a good amount of wastes to keep in this deck, particularly because we do have Solemn Simulacrum, we do have Burnished Heart, we do play with Pilgrim's Eye, but also more importantly, we have to remember that if our opponents are targeting us with spells like Assassin's Trophy, or if we get Field of Ruined, or maybe it's going to be Path to Exile, we don't want to run out of ways in which to reap the benefits of those spells by not having enough basic lands in the deck. So at this moment, we've got 6 basics, and I think that's going to be our line in the sand. If we have any future installments of the Up and Up series for Kozilek, if a non-basic land is going in, it most likely is going to have to take the place of a different non-basic land. So with this second waste coming out, the card replacing it is Bonder's Enclave. Taps for a colorless. We can pay 3, tap this, and draw a card, but this is an ability we can only activate if we control a creature with power 4 or greater. We're running a colorless Eldrazi deck. I'm pretty sure we're going to have a creature with a power 4 or greater, and paying 3 mana and tapping the Enclave to draw a card, well, that's just going to make our deck even stronger by having these peripheral card draw effects. All right, a Mana Rock is going in. Actually, we got more than 1 Mana Rock going in. This one is Everflowing Chalice. Yes, it has a mana value of 0, but it has multi-kicker of 2. So we may pay an additional 2 generic mana any number of times as we cast the spell. Everflowing Chalice will enter the battlefield with a charge counter on it for each time that we kick it. Then we can tap it and add a colorless mana to our mana pool for each charge counter on Everflowing Chalice. So this is going to be a great place to sink our mana early, mid, or late game, clearly for the purposes of ramping ahead of our opponents. And let's face it, Kozilek is going to be a lightning rod for attention, and as much colorless mana as we can generate on our side of the battlefield to cast him over and over and over again, the more the better. Everflowing Chalice is coming in, and it's going to replace Thematic Compass. So here we have an artifact for 2 generic mana. We can pay 3, tap this to search our library for a basic land. We reveal it, and we put it into our hand. So that effect in and of itself is not really that great. So we're investing 3 mana each time to activate the Thematic Compass, and all we're getting out of it is putting a wastes into our hand. I'm not sure that the Everflowing Chalice can't do a better job of providing us mana, and that's exactly what it came down to. That artifact is going to do more for us from a mana standpoint than the Thematic Compass can do. And that's even if we are able to trigger this and transform it at the beginning of our end step. If we control 7 or more lands, we end up transforming Thematic Compass, and it transforms into the Spires of Araska. Now what this is we can tap it for a colorless mana, or we can tap this to untap target attacking creature an opponent controls and remove it from combat. So that's kind of a variation of Maze of Ith, which, I mean, that's not a terrible ability to have, particularly in a colorless deck where, let's face it, our interaction and our removal spells and our disruption suites not as strong as having any combination of colors. But let's face it, for the overall purposes of what we want to do in this deck, Everflowing Chalice is going to do more overall than what Thematic Compass can, and that is why it's being replaced. The next card going in is a card that just became available. So with that in mind, Mana Crypt forces its way into this deck. We don't really need to spend too much time talking about how good this card is. Just be mindful of your life total. If you're flipping those coins and you're losing those flips and you're dipping lower and lower and lower, you don't want to be the player to lose to your own Mana Crypt, so maybe it would be in our best interests to pop it off the battlefield just so that we don't kill ourselves with our own Crypt. With Mana Crypt going in, providing even more of a mana boost, coming out is going to be Scroll Rack. Now, Scroll Rack was in here for the purposes of card selection. This does not necessarily draw us cards because the cards that are in our hand are being replaced by new cards, but those cards are going back on top of our library in any order. So it's not as if, I mean, we do have some card advantages through Scroll Rack, but more importantly, what we're looking to do here is we're looking to jump quicker out of the gate. When we put those cards on the top of our library by activating Scroll Rack, we don't have a ton of ways to shuffle our library away and, make sure that we don't redraw those cards, particularly when we're trying to cast Kozilek as many times as possible to replenish the cards in our hand. So from this thought process, the overall idea was creating a bigger jump, a bigger boost in overall mana production with Mana Crypt by removing let's call it a peripherally beneficial artifact like Scroll Rack, even though the Mana Crypt only costs 0 mana and the Scroll Rack is 2. It's not necessarily a mana value concern. It's more about what cards do we want in our hand that we can get onto the battlefield that are going to help us the best way possible. Mana Crypt is going to do more for us than Scroll Rack can. And that's really what it came down to. I mean, we're not going to not include Mana Crypt. And with this deck having as many revisions as it has had over the years, we're getting to the point where every single artifact, every single card in this deck is going to have to fend for itself and be the right fit. And right now, where we are with Kozilek as the general, I don't think Scroll Rack is the right fit. All right, moving away from lands and mana rocks, we've got some creatures to add to this deck. There are 5 creatures going in. And the first creature, boy, I really missed this creature when I was first putting this deck together. And I got to be honest with you, I'm a little disappointed that I did, because this is a very, very underrated Eldrazi option. And it's Pathraiser of Ulamog. We've got a 9/9 with Annihilator 3 for 11 mana. Now, that Annihilator 3 is nothing to turn one's nose up at. Whenever Pathraiser of Ulamog attacks, defending player will sacrifice 3 permanents. We all know Annihilator can be inordinately powerful. However, Pathraiser cannot be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. So this is 1.5 times menace. You need 3 creatures to block Pathraiser of Ulamog. This is going to become a game of numbers. Does an opponent have a healthy enough life total to absorb that 9 damage, in addition to sacrificing the 3 permanents from the Annihilator trigger? Or are they going to have to throw at least 3 of their creatures in Pathraiser's way to block it? And how many of those creatures are they going to lose? Let's face it, this is a card that probably should have been in this deck since its inception. With that card going in and the offensive threat that it poses, one card coming out, it's going to be one Eldrazi is going to replace another, and that's going to be Artisan of Kozilek. Here we have a 10/9 with Annihilator of 2, so we still have, the body size is a little bit bigger on the Artisan. The Annihilator isn't as big. It's 2 less mana, but when Artisan of Kozilek, when we cast it, we may return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. Here's the thing about this card. We don't have a ton of creature cards in this deck. Many of our creature cards have auto-shuffle effects, where when they hit the graveyard from anywhere, and we're thinking about the Eldrazi Titans, original Kozilek, original Ulamog, the Blightsteel Colossus, when those creatures hit the graveyard, they get shuffled back into our library. And for the Eldrazi Titans, they take the graveyard with them and get shuffled into the library as well. And plus, with some of our other creature spells like Walking Ballista, it's an XX. If we return that to the battlefield, it ends up dying. The creature recursion aspect of this card is not as powerful as it might have seemed at the beginning of this deck's construction. So we're going to take out again, we're following the mold of a peripherally maybe okay card to be replaced by one that can do so much more work. That's what the Mana Crypt did with Scroll Rack. That's what Pathraiser of Ulamog is doing with Artisan of Kozilek. Next creature going in, it is Koldatha Forgemaster. Here we have a 5/5 that we can tap and sacrifice 3 artifacts, and then we can search our library for an artifact card and put it onto the battlefield. Note that we can sacrifice Koldatha Forgemaster to itself. It could be one of the 3 artifacts that we sacrifice. What are we going to put on to our side of the battlefield? How about the aforementioned Blightsteel Colossus? Or maybe we put on Darksteel Forge. Or maybe we're just going to put on something like Planar Bridge. Either way, Koldatha Forgemaster helps to utilize our library as an outlet for getting a very, very impactful artifact from there onto the battlefield at just the cost of 3 artifacts. Koldatha Forgemaster is going to replace Hangerback Walker. Here, this comes into play with X+1/+1 counters on it, and when it dies, we create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying for each +1/+1 counter on Hangerback Walker. And we can pay 1 tap this to put a +1/+1 counter on it. I don't hate Hangerback Walker. I'm not in love with it either. It's one of those, yeah, I'll spend a little bit of time with you, but I'm not going to dedicate an entire weekend. Hangerback Walker is just painfully slow in this deck. It just kind of lumbers around on the battlefield. It itself doesn't have evasion, so it's not as if we can really send it into combat comfortably. It kind of just sits back, and maybe we'll put a +1/+1 counter on it. I mean, if we have the ability to put a ton of +1/+1 counters on Hangerback Walker, that means we have the ability to generate a ton of mana. If we're going to put a ton of mana into something, we have many, many better options than funneling that mana into Hangerback Walker. So, Koldatha Forgemaster in, Hangerback Walker coming out. Next card going in, Geode Golem. We have a 5/3 trampler that when it deals combat damage to a player, we may cast our commander from the command zone without paying its mana cost. Note that this CMC is only 5. Note that it has trample. Note that it has a healthy power of 5. And also note we don't have to sacrifice the golem in order to trigger its casting our commander from the command zone ability. So in effect, we could utilize this multiple times during a game. We still have to pay the commander tax if there is any, of course, but still, to get our commander onto the battlefield as quickly as we can in a deck that thrives on ramping mana rocks onto the battlefield, that 5 casting cost, we could get that down on turn 3. We could technically do it on turn 1 if we drew enough of the right cards. But still, this provides versatility in a deck that we have not yet experienced. Getting Kozilek into play for free, it is cast. His trigger will trigger. We will draw those cards. Geode Golem is going into play. Is going into the 99 and is easily going to replace Eldrazi Mimic. It's a 2/1, and whenever another colorless creature enters the battlefield under our control, we may change this guy's base power and toughness to that creature's power and toughness until end of turn. We're just getting to... excuse me. Sorry about that. We're just getting to the point where an ability like that is not enough. We need a bigger bang. Even though this has a mana value of only 2, it is not enough. Look at what Geode Golem can do versus this. Yes, the mana value is 5 here and only 2 here, but even in the best case scenario, let's say we have an Eldrazi come into play. Let's say we have Kozilek come into play. We get a 12/12. It has no evasion. It can't do anything but get chump blocked. Eldrazi Mimic is not doing enough anymore. It has become an obsolete memory. Thank you. Geode Golem. All right, we've got 2 cards left. Next up is Wandering Archaic. A copy became available, and it is forcing its way into the 99. It's a 4/4 avatar, and whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery spell, they may pay 2 mana. If they don't, we copy that spell, and we may choose new targets for the copy. This is going to fit us so very well. We have so few instant and sorcery spells in this deck because of its colorless theme. Wandering Archaic allows us to get a little taste of what our opponents are feasting on throughout the game. There is a backside to this card, but we don't ever want to cast Explore the Vastlands. It is instant and sorcery card dependent, which we have very few of, and our opponents have very many of. We do not ever want to cast this card. It's all Wandering Archaic all of the time. That's going in, and it's going to replace Lithiform Engine. Alright, so we know what Lithiform Engine can do. We can pay some mana and tap it to copy target activated or triggered ability we control, target instant or sorcery spell we control, and target permanent spell we control. Alright, so let's talk about what we could really do with this card in this deck. And it's not as much as you might think. The copy target instant and sorcery spell activated ability, we can barely even use that. What are we going to do? Play All Is Dust twice in the same turn? So that doesn't really help us out very much. The paying 4 and tapping this to copy target permanent spell we control. Alright, so we have our Eldrazi, which almost all of them are legendary. I mean, I suppose we could put an additional copy of Blightsteel Colossus in play. I suppose we could pay 4 mana to put another Mana Crypt in play. But is that really what we want to do with our mana? I'm not convinced that this is the best card in this deck right now. Additionally, the copying of target activated or triggered ability we control, yes, we can definitely copy the Annihilator triggers of our Eldrazi, but keep in mind, we only have a handful of those in this deck, and our General doesn't even have one of those Annihilator triggers. So is Lithiform Engine, as awesome of a card as it is it doing enough in this deck for the way in which it's sculpted right now? I don't think so. I think Wandering Archaic would be a much more valuable addition than keeping Lithiform Engine. Alright, the last revision for this build going into the deck as our last change, it is Liberator, Urza's Battlethopter. We got a 1/2 flying flash Thopter here, and we may cast colorless spells and artifact spells as though they had flash. That's every spell in our deck. And whenever we cast a spell, if the amount of mana spent to cast it is greater than Liberator's power, we put a +1/+1 counter onto this Thopter. It's only a 1/2, so it seems very likely that this is going to get many +1/+1 counters. Plus, with the flash enablement to every single spell in our deck, Liberator is going to do a lot of heavy lifting in this deck, and it is a welcomed addition to the 99. With that coming in, something has to come out, and that something is going to be Nevinyrral's Disc. This is a board wipe that gets rid of all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments, but it enters the battlefield tapped, and we can't use it right away unless we wait till our next turn or have some way to untap it. So more often than not, this is getting blown up before we even have the chance to activate it. I would much rather slightly weaken our overall suite of removal and disruption spells, and I say slightly because this rarely does anything in this build. I'd rather slightly weaken that and put in an absolute powerhouse like Liberator for the purposes of being a lot more powerful on the battlefield, a lot more proactive versus the limited reactionary stance that Nevinyrral's Disc can provide. All right, there you have it, MTG BC. We have updated and upgraded Kozilek the Great Distortion. Let me know your thoughts about these changes in the comments section below. But before you do, let me also say we are close to welcoming with arms wide open Kozilek the Great Distortion into the Burgeoning Commander Catalog. Let me know what you think about that in the comments section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.